Can you believe it? 400 hours put into both God of War 1 and Ragnarok. Then another 400 hours covering both games in a 2.5-hour video. And here we are, a measly 800 views later. Now is the perfect opportunity to grab onto this rocket ship soaring through space and time by devoting another 100 hours into both games, and if the formula is consistent, garner another 100 views. Although it would be cool to reach a number that's in line with the 1,000,000 views my bedroom ceiling has gotten as I wait for recognition for hundreds of hours of hard work, I'm an incredibly humble guy. But speaking of putting multiple hours into something with no actual payoff, I decided to try beating both of these games on Give Me God of War, and basically re-platinuming them. After damn near 1,000 hours with 2 games playing and covering them, you're not really done until you're done. Until you've milked the games for everything they have to offer. Now, the hardest difficulty of a game can go down one of 2 paths. One of endless torture, or one of a greatly enhanced experience. And the exciting thing is today we get to cover both. As far as which one follows the path of a greatly enhanced experience, if it isn't blatantly obvious to you, regardless of which difficulty you've played on, you're an idiot. God of War Ragnarok makes advancements in literally every aspect of gameplay, so much so that the feeling I usually get when playing games on their hardest difficulty, where I'm way too dialed in and just sinking endless hours into failed attempts, internally screaming, "Why the fuck am I doing this?" was completely non-existent. Unless of course you're counting endgame super bosses, where that's kind of the whole point. To those who aren't familiar with Give Me God of War, I'll bore you with the obvious shit. Enemies do increased damage, are more relentless with their attacks, are faster, have higher defenses, are harder to stun, blah blah blah. There's probably more unique shit that I never noticed because the game just decides not to tell you up front, but that's fine. But the most important change, and the most noticeable that's exclusive to the difficulty, is Elite Mode. All it takes is one single smack to the face of a common enemy, and immediately they're ready to make your life a living hell. They gain some of their health back and increase their power level by 1, thus taking less damage and dishing out higher damage. In this form, almost all attacks won't stagger them, the exceptions being certain combo finishers, certain heavy attacks, runic attacks, and Spartan rage attacks. What this means is you gotta have your eyes on everything at all times and have the processing speed of a fucking sentient AI. The good news is, if you spot an enemy about to go elite, you can stop that shit with an attack that would stagger them in their standard form. Easy peasy. The bad news is, as long as that enemy is alive, it always has an opportunity to go elite, so singling out enemies that you can't afford to deal with at a higher level is a top priority, and also a top pain in the ass. Especially when you're in a mob fight with multiple enemies that can all easily get caught in an attack intended for one of them, thus increasing the number of enemies that can go elite. This is the first instance where Ragnarok becomes a much more enjoyable experience, as it gives you more opportunities to stagger enemies, thanks to some sexy new skills, triangle charge attacks, the added shield types, and also thanks to having the Chaos Blades the entire game. Now maybe God of War 1 on New Game Plus, on this difficulty, is a more enjoyable experience, but that doesn't save it from the fact that I didn't play New Game Plus on this difficulty for Ragnarok, and Ragnarok is a much better game. In God of War 1, I can't count the amount of times I failed to stop enemies from going elite, especially in the early game when your attacks are very limited. It makes a majority of the opening half of the game pretty boring, as if it wasn't already. Sorry. All it is a shitload of running up to enemies doing R1, 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 or R2, 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 repeat. And almost all of those basic combos can end with you knocking back an enemy, and if you then become overwhelmed by other enemies, cause this is fucking Give Me God of War, it leaves that enemy you knocked back free to go elite, and makes the fight even more painful. The early game in God of War 1 on this difficulty just feels like it wasn't designed for it at all. Before you even get a chance to get a decent chunk of skills to vary the combat, you're thrown into small mob fights that feel like you just stepped into the final dungeon of the game underleveled. Doing chip damage to common Draugr as they swarm you relentlessly, just begging you to get tired of doing the same shit over and over again and let your guard down. Now if you're a seasoned Give Me God of War vet, you might point me in the direction of even more tedious and boring strategies to simplify things, like focusing on ring outs or pinning enemies to the wall. Highly effective stuff, especially in the early game of God of War 1, but they aren't nearly as fun and inviting as all the options you have at your disposal in Ragnarok. that eliminate the need for boring as fuck strategies that have you getting one over on enemies instead of tearing them to pieces. Experience points that are tied to characters instead of applying to both Kratos and Atreus, so you're not worrying about pouring it into Atreus' skills and possibly sacrificing ways to diversify the combat as Kratos. Another big contribution that makes things fresh and new and once again inviting in Ragnarok is all the abilities and perks associated with different armor sets. How no matter when in the game you get them, if you thoroughly enjoy the perks that come with the package, you can hold on to that package tightly throughout the full duration of the playthrough with upgrades. Whereas in God of War 1, you'll be forced to follow a more hit-and-quit method of armor customization, where your current armor set, assuming it isn't a late-game acquisition, will probably lose its usefulness within an hour or two, never to be seen again. But does it even matter when there's not nearly as many cool abilities attached to those armor sets as Ragnarok? Some of my favorites including Lunda's poison armor set. The armor is great for forcing you to do bare-handed attacks that kind of take a back seat in Ragnarok, to inflict poison that lowers an enemy's level by 1, making it an incredibly useful tool for dealing with elite enemies, or just any enemies. I actually used it all the way through the end of the game. There's also the rage set that I used for a brief moment and then considered it cheating, so I stopped. It allows you to deal more damage based on how much rage you currently have stored. The cheating part is it makes your rage meter a second health bar, essentially. When you get hit with attacks that would normally kill you, the rage meter will then absorb the damage, saving you from death until you run out. That armor set, along with a rage talisman and resurrection stones, is a great strategy if you were interested in being a fucking pussy. But it's definitely worth promoting if you're someone who wants to say you beat the game on Give Me God of War, but you suck. You get this armor, I'd say, about a third of the way into the playthrough, depending on your skill set. I believe it's in the Vanaheim first visit. And there isn't really any roadblocks that could stop you on the way to getting it, so there's your incentive. I'm happy to say that for both games, the fact that I had no choice but to switch up my armor got me to warm up to all the different sets I once thought were hideously grotesque and unwanted. While this game is no stranger to making you look like a hill of shit with a beard, I was too hard on the armor in the past. I was wrong, and I accept that. Maybe it's not fair to just revisit all the complaints I made when I initially compared these two games, but there's also things like God of War 1's lack of enemy variety, not as fun side content, slower traversal and realm travel, etc, etc. But these things have to be mentioned when there's such a huge factor in whether or not you're actually having fun. And even though playing through the Vanaheim crater section again allowed me to grow a more deeper hatred for how fucking confusing it is to explore, it's very telling of how much better a game Ragnarok is when it has more to do than the first game, but still feels like it's moving at a faster pace. Because time flies when you're having fun. If I'm not having as much fun, I'm not going to want to pour more hours into side content to make me stronger, thus setting me up to get my fucking ass kicked. But even with a boatload of side content done prior to the final hours of the main story, I still felt underleveled at times in the first game. God of War 1 just doesn't allow enough experimenting. At almost all times, even with a bunch of side content done, every time I got access to some new stuff, it costed all the hack silver I had currently. And it doesn't help that, like the skills, Atreus' strength is tied to the same currency as Kratos, which puts you in a constant state of what should I sacrifice in a not fun at all way. See, I'm the kind of person that likes to stare at all the options I have in the shops and skill trees for an hour, eventually come to a decision, and then not implement that decision into my strategy in any way. Well, that's a lie, because in Ragnarok, by the tail end of the game, I felt like a Rhodes Scholar in terms of using perks. Let me tell you something, it is insanely satisfying to understand how a mechanic works and then executing it to perfection without the use of online guides. Because if you use online guides for anything other than finding collectibles to eliminate hassles, you're a fucking loser. I don't understand the point of playing games at a higher difficulty if you have to look up how to cheese it. Especially when both of these games share a very disappointing issue, and that's giving you literally nothing for beating the game at the highest difficulty, not even a meaningless fucking trophy. In God of War 1, for beating the game on Give Me God of War, you get 2 shield skins that have no special abilities attached, and can't even be seen in-game unless you pull up the fucking menu, so what the hell is the point? In Ragnarok, you get literally nothing, unless I'm missing something. And it also sucks that while the higher difficulty forced me to broaden my horizon a little bit in terms of combat options, thus changing the experience, the difficulty itself just doesn't offer any exclusive perks, or at least none that I noticed, to make things more fun. I hate when difficulties only emphasize the greater challenge and never emphasize greater rewards, greater incentives in the fight abilities that are hard to execute but offer some cool advancements in the gameplay. This difficulty is called Give Me God of War, so give me something. Give me some extra experience points at the start so I have more combat options readily available to me. Give me a special weapon or shield attachment that's worth the price of my suffering. Unfortunately, the loudest give me I was chanting in God of War 1 almost exclusively was give me a break, as it gave me more and more reasons to break my controller and the game case on camera. There are multiple mob fights that give you no room to breathe because the enemies are relentless and overpowered. And while this is consistent with Ragnarok, all the options, like I've said in the past, all the options you have, especially if you're doing side content, weathers the storm significantly. Like I said, some early game ones feel like a time-stoneless Doctor Strange is already looking at me from across the battlefield, withering away to dust. Endgame. And the actual endgame mob fights in the Jotunheim Tower are just fucking uncalled for. You know, it's fitting that in a game that gives you limited resources to experiment with different armors and weapon pommels, leaves you completely defenseless in this scenario. As once you enter the Jotunheim Tower, you cannot go back to change any of the poor decisions you've made. I don't know if the game warns you prior, but I don't give a fuck. You're just left there to rot, or excel beyond the 100-foot high pile of shit you've just been thrown into. Or if you're smart and make manual saves constantly, you may be in the clear. As far as bosses, before the Jotunheim Tower mob fights, the Elf King in Alfheim was the sole reason I said I would never tackle this difficulty again. A boss that runs away constantly, breaks out of every stagger in milliseconds, and punishes you for parrying his attacks by leaving behind bombs that blind you? Sign me up. There is nothing fun about this fight. Kratos' ranged attacks are limited, especially if you didn't buy the precision throw. His attacks in general are limited because it's an early game boss. Most of your runic attacks can leave you open to get hit or blinded because this guy breaks out of literally fucking everything. And like I said, punishing the player for timing a perfect parry is absolute horseshit. It's literally just run at a slow pace to go do 2 hits, the fight. When it comes to the other mandatory bosses, the only time where things get really hectic is surprise when you put multiple enemies on the field just to complicate things. Or in Magni and Modi's case, just be fighting 2 bosses at once, but I wouldn't say that fight isn't manageable. I spent a good chunk of time on the boulder fight solely due to the segment with all those undead enemies that grab you. I get that every hard difficulty is bound to have shit that overwhelms you at points, but that doesn't mean it's ever fucking enjoyable. I will give Baldur credit though, as even though the end result of his boss fight was creating a fucking psychopath.
Heal first. Heal. Heal all the way, and now I'm gonna fucking pound your fucking ass again. And then heal all the way again. Then heal all the fucking way again, you motherfucker! Heal all the way again. Stupid fuck!
On his own, he managed to be quite the challenge. A while back during my first playthrough of Ragnarok, a coworker of mine was telling me how he was playing on Give Me God of War and how it took him 3 whole fucking hours to beat Odin. Wow. I'm sure that it was agonizing the whole time, but that's an ultimate fucking flex, bro. Yeah, I beat Phase 1 first try, Phase 2 I died twice. And just to throw more shade, I think even if I was underleveled, the only suffering I would have endured was how long it would have took to kill this old pathetic sack of shit. Odin's attacks are grand spectacles, but it's fairly easy to just watch the pretty elemental fireworks as they breeze past you. Everything's fairly reactable, though I think if the huge fireballs he spawned came jolting towards you instead of fucking just coming at you at the pace of a fucking snail, well, a snail, how original, it would greatly increase the difficulty of the fight. Odin loses on both difficulty and scale to Baldur in exchange for tons of pretty colors and Bifrost, which I'm not complaining about, but the All-Father is all talk, no bite. I wasn't even trying hard in these attempts. I was just eager to polish off the rest of the beer I had left and get the drunken, yeah, I did it, out of the way as fast as I could. By the way, cheers. Thor is actually more difficult in comparison. His attacks close in on you and require awkward timing to dodge based on the combo, so it's real easy to fuck up the timing and then be scrambling for a reset to regain composure. The fact that a rundown 500-pound bowl of drunken depression is faster and more unrelenting than the god of all gods is funny. One thing I gotta mention before I get into the endgame side content is the checkpoint system with boss fights. I understand fights like the Needhog fight are long and have cutscenes in between, but if I'm playing on the hardest difficulty, I don't think I should be allowed any checkpoints. But maybe that's just me, I like to fucking suffer. In order to avoid this and truly beat the bosses, I just kept reloading the same save I made at the start of the fight. I didn't do this for God of War 1, because I hilariously wasn't even thinking about it. That's how prevalent the feeling of let's get this over with, I'm not having fun was when I was playing on that difficulty for the first game. Speaking of that, the Muspelheim trials in 1 still suck. And while I initially liked the idea of climbing the volcano to get to the top, I forgot how painful it is to get to each of the challenges when you need to do 3 again to get the hardest challenge to unlock at the top. Fucking pain in the ass. When I played through the trials in Ragnarok on Give Me a Challenge, I told myself that I'd never fucking play them again on Give Me God of War because of how incredibly ridiculous I thought some of the big 6 challenges were. But it turns out I was just underleveled. And to reiterate myself 1,000 times, having a decent knowledge on how the perks work can make these fights a cakewalk if you're skilled enough. And that's a theme that carries over into almost all of the endgame side content in Ragnarok, including the Berserkers and Gná. Difficult and demanding, yet easy and rewarding when you know what you're doing. And that's the perfect formula when playing a game at the highest difficulty. The Valkyries just don't hold a candle to the Berserkers in terms of challenge and more fun to dodge and parry attacks. There's at least a couple of Valkyrie fights that shouldn't even qualify as super bosses at all, when they're just spamming the same easily dodgeable attack over and over again. While it sounds more fun to be fighting a band of imprisoned Odin side pieces rather than just being the god of ghost busting, it's not. The one thing the Berserker encounters have that I don't like is the hardest of them being the ones with multiple Berserkers. But like I said, and I'll continue to say another 1,000 times, it's a problem, like all others, that can be easily avoided when you know what you're doing. The only exception is when you face the Poison Berserker and don't know what you're doing yet. This fight is a fucking joke. On his own, the Poison Berserker is fairly easy to deal with. The problem is he spawns and will consistently respawn a group of fucking assholes consisting of 2 of the most annoying enemy types in the game. The Nightmares shoot projectiles constantly that carry poison. Their bomb attacks are one-shots. Hellwalkers can fucking glue themselves to you from across the map. And because this is Give Me God of War, they attack much faster and more frequently. The Berserker himself can be throwing his own projectiles to distract you. It's really fucking easy to just get blinded by all the different shit on screen while Atreus could just be like fucking whiffing his shots at Nightmares. And trying to single out Nightmares with all the other elements at play is incredibly painful. Now I could have just came back to that fight at a higher level, but I never do that unless all the attacks one-shot me and my damage output is fucking trash. Also, if I choose to fight a super boss at any given time, I don't know if anybody can relate to me on this, I won't stop until I beat it. I get so sucked in that for a good chunk of time, I usually never try a different approach by like switching up my armor or weapon handles. I just go for the same shit over and over again that keeps getting me killed until it no longer gets me killed. But I strongly advise any who'd listen to never fight this fucking asshole until you've upgraded like all your shit to level 9 and have a bunch of poison resistance buffs. You're welcome. Okay, so on to the King Berserker, Sigrun, and Gná. This time around, I actually found Gná's attack patterns and combos much easier to deal with and a little bit more predictable than Sigrun or the King. And that's partly due to a little trick that I developed from Sigrun for the lunging attacks, which is you hold up the shield to prepare for the wing slash attack while moving to the right at the same time in case she does the wing stab. And 7 to 8 times out of 10, you'll be prepared for both. That was until I realized if she dodges to the left it's a wing slash and to the right wing stab, which made the fight even more easy, but still incredibly rewarding. With that knowledge, I just couldn't help myself but to do a no damage run. That's on the channel. And not at all impressive compared to some of the YouTubers who do it with style. Check out Gamebreaker God's like no damage vids or just any God of War content that he puts up, and your mind will be blown. But with Gná, the only thing different from just facing her at a lower difficulty and handicapping yourself is she's a tiny bit faster on Give Me God of War. Which actually kind of worked out in my favor, because she has very few like awkward stalls in between attacks. This is another instance where knowledge of perks and fucking abilities destroy any challenge this game throws at you. It took me hours to beat Gná the first time that I fought her, and here I beat her in like 4 or 5 tries. I actually got close to beating her first try and was ready to laugh with glee, but then the one completely fucking unfair thing happened. Gná's unstoppable aura is bullshit. I have no idea how it works, but dying in the middle of a runic attack while you're already staggering an enemy because they broke out randomly through no fault of your own is beyond bullshit. But it at least wasn't something that I encountered regularly. The only reason I think Sigrun took me 2.5 hours to beat is because I wasn't studying the game's mechanics as much as I did with Ragnarok. See, I said the same shit again, but I switched up the wording a little. The King Berserker I think is my favorite fight across both games. I find his attack patterns less predictable and a little bit harder to time than Sigrun or Gana's. He has two basically one-shot attacks that make things increasingly intense on this difficulty. The shield strike attack, he could start charging up further away than what I experienced with Gana, so frantically running over to break it up, knowing I'm dead if I don't, was adrenaline-inducing. And the thing that solidifies this as my favorite fight is how in the end he starts like emitting Bifrost infinitely, basically like forcing you to no damage your way to the finish line. So much fun. But that's going to do it as far as my thoughts on the difficulty and my final thoughts on the games in general. If any of this, much like my previous video, isn't crystal clear, as always,
Ragnarok wins.
So much so that I'd say with the first game, it isn't worth the hassle to play on Gimme God of War. New game. If you haven't seen my God of War vs. God of War Ragnarok video, I urge you to give it a go. There's way more effort put forth, and the story section alone is worth the price of admission. That price being an hour of your time. If you like this, leave a like, comment, and perhaps subscribe, and I just might make some more.